Welcome to our deep dive into Eric Berne's Games People Play. This book is, well, it's really all about figuring out those sometimes confusing interactions we have.
Yeah.
Like, why do we do the things we do with other people?
Yeah, and how do those little, often hidden motivations play out?
Exactly. We'll be unpacking how people structure their time, how we spend our days, and then how these games, as Berne calls them, how they kind of pop up. It's like they're woven into the fabric of our lives.
It's fascinating, really, how Berne doesn't just describe these games. He, pulls back the curtain and you see those hidden motivations driving them.
It's like getting a backstage pass to how our minds work in social situations.
Exactly.
But before we jump into the games themselves, there are a few key concepts we got to understand.
Okay, lay it on me.
Berne talks about this thing called stimulus hunger, and then also recognition hunger. And then, get this, structure hunger.
3 hungers. I like it.
Right. So have you ever found yourself, just endlessly scrolling through social media, or maybe just feeling this pull to do something, even if it's not particularly productive?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Well, that's a great example of stimulus hunger in action.
Makes sense. We get bored, we got to do something.
Right. But Berne, he argues that it's more than just boredom. It's like we have this basic need for stimulation, like in the same way we need food.
So we're hungry for stimulation, hungry for acknowledgement from others, and structure hunger. What's that again?
It's like we crave a sense of order, a framework for our lives.
Oh, okay, yeah, I get that.
And it's not just some touchy-feely concept. Berne points to this thing called the reticular activating system. It's part of our brain, and it needs a certain level of stimulation to function properly. If it doesn't get that, we can experience some pretty negative effects, like both physically and mentally.
Wow, so it's actually a biological need.
Yeah, so we're not just making this up. It's like built into our wiring. So to meet these needs, these hungers, we structure our time in different ways. Berne lays out this framework of 5 main categories.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Hit me.
All right, so we got rituals, pastimes, games, intimacy, and activity. We'll tackle those one by one.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
So first up, rituals. These are those predictable social interactions we all do. Think greetings, good morning, how are you? We all know the script.
Yeah, totally. It's like we're on autopilot.
Right. Then we got pastimes. These are those light conversations, just chatting about the weather, or the latest news, stuff like that.
Water cooler talk.
Exactly. Now, activity in this context, this is what we usually think of as work. It's those tasks where we're, really engaging with the external world to get things done.
Okay, that one's straightforward. So then what about games?
Aha. Now things get interesting. When we say games, we usually think of fun, right?
Right, like something enjoyable.
But in Berne's framework, a game is something a bit different. It's a series of transactions with a hidden motive, and there's a payoff that's often unconscious. It's not about enjoyment, really. It's about meeting those deeper psychological needs, the stimulus, recognition, and structure.
So even though we might not realize it, we're getting something out of it, even if it's not always good for us.
Exactly. Even if what you're getting isn't, healthy or positive in the long run.
It's like we're getting our needs met, but in a sneaky way, I guess.
Right, often with unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And then there's that 5th category, intimacy.
Oh, yeah, intimacy. That's a big one.
Berne sees intimacy as, well, it's like the most fulfilling way to structure our time. It's all about genuine connection, really connecting with another person, but without those hidden agendas, without those manipulations that we see in games.
Sounds nice in theory, but I bet it's a lot harder to achieve in real life.
Oh, I think you're right. It requires a level of vulnerability and authenticity. And that can be challenging, especially I think when we've been conditioned to interact through these games.
We got to unlearn those old habits.
Yeah.
But before we get there, I think we need to talk about this concept of transactional analysis.
Right. Okay, yeah, that's another big one. Berne says we all operate from these 3 different ego states: the parent, the adult, and the child.
The parent, the adult, and the child. I'm picturing an internal committee meeting.
I know, right? It's kind of funny to think about it that way.
Yeah.
So break it down for me. What does it actually mean to be operating from, say, the parent ego state versus the adult or the child?
Okay, so picture this. The parent, that's like the embodiment of all the attitudes and behaviors we learn from our parents.
Yeah.
Right. Or other authority figures. It's that voice of authority, sometimes critical, sometimes nurturing.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the adult?
The adult is our rational side. It's like the problem-solving self. Think of it as the voice of logic and reason.
So, Mr. Spock,
Exactly. And finally, the child. This is the seat of our emotions,
Mm.
our impulses, our creativity. It's that part of us that feels joy, sadness, anger, all of it.
So throughout the day, we're kind of switching between these different ego states depending on what's happening and who we're with.
Yeah, exactly. And these ego states, they interact in our transactions. That's just another word for our exchanges, our interactions with others.
Okay, so give me an example. How does this actually play out?
Okay, picture a surgeon, right? Calmly asking for his scalpel. And the assistant, they hand it over, no problem. That's a smooth adult-to-adult transaction.
Right, so it's like everyone's on the same page, same wavelength.
Exactly. Communication flows when transactions are straightforward like that, when the ego states match up.
But what happens when they don't match up?
That's when we see what Berne calls cross-transactions.
Uh-oh. Sounds messy.
It can be. Imagine a boss, they're giving an employee feedback. But the boss, they're speaking from like a critical parent ego state. But the employee, they respond from, let's say, a rebellious child ego state.
Ooh, that's not going to end well.
Not usually. Communication breaks down, right?
Yeah, big time.
These mismatches, they're often the root of conflict and miscommunication because the responses aren't what the other person was expecting.
And I'm guessing these cross-transactions, they play a big role in those games we were talking about earlier.
Oh, absolutely. They're like the fuel for the fire.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's even a hidden message beneath the surface, what Berne calls ulterior transactions.
Okay, now you're really blowing my mind. Like inception levels of communication here.
Right. So think about someone who's flirting.
Mhm.
But their underlying motive is to make someone else jealous.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic game.
That's a game in action. Ulterior motive masked by like a seemingly innocent interaction.
So there's this whole other layer of communication happening that we're often not even aware of.
Exactly. And that's why relationships can be so darn complicated.
Right.
Recognizing these ulterior motives and like understanding which ego states are driving our interactions, that's key to understanding how games work.
This is a lot to take in, but it's fascinating. It's like you're giving me a whole new way of looking at how people communicate.
I'm glad to hear it. It's like decoding a secret language.
So we've talked about stimulus hunger, ego states, cross-transactions, ulterior motives. I think we've laid a pretty solid foundation here.
I agree. We're ready to tackle those games head on.
All right, so we've laid the groundwork. We talked about all that stuff, the stimulus, hunger, ego states, all that jazz. Now I want to dive into some real-life examples of these games. What you got?
Okay, let's start with a classic one, a real classic. It's called If It Weren't For You, or sometimes people just call it IWFY. This game often plays out in relationships,
Yeah.
where one person blames their partner for like limiting their choices in life.
Oh, so it's like, if it weren't for you, I could have pursued my dream career. Or, if it weren't for you, I'd be traveling the world.
Yeah, exactly. If it weren't for you. And the payoff for the person who's playing this game, it's kind of twofold.
Okay, how so?
Well, on the one hand, they get to avoid taking responsibility, like for their own fears or insecurities. But then at the same time, they're gaining sympathy, right? Maybe even some material benefits.
Oh, I see. It's like they get to have their cake and eat it too.
Kind of. It's like a way of saying, my life isn't what I want it to be, and it's your fault.
Wow, yeah. I can see how that would create a lot of resentment. What about the other person? What's their role in this whole scenario?
Well, they might be playing the persecutor, but unknowingly. They're kind of reinforcing that dynamic by giving in to those complaints.
So it becomes like this self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. The more one person complains, the more the other tries to, appease them. And it just keeps that game going round and round.
So how do you break free? How do you get out of that cycle?
Well, Bernard, he believed that the first step is recognizing the game. You got to see it happening. Awareness is key.
Okay, makes sense. So what happens next? How do you change the dynamic?
Well, the person on the receiving end, they can try to shift the focus, right, from blame to action.
So instead of getting caught in that blame game.
Right. They might say something like, okay, but what steps can you take to pursue that dream, regardless of me, regardless of my involvement?
Oh, I like that. It puts the responsibility back on the person who wants to make that change. Okay, so that's If It Weren't For You. What's another game people should know about?
Let's talk about Alcoholic. This one's really interesting because Barad's analysis, it focuses on these psychological payoffs, but the less obvious ones. It goes beyond just the simple act of liking to drink.
Oh, so you're saying there's more to it than just enjoying that, the feeling of being drunk. What else is going on?
Right. So for some people, the real payoff, it might come from, well, from the misery of the hangover.
The hangover.
Really, yeah. Because the hangover generates all this attention and sympathy. So they're setting themselves up for this cycle of self-destruction,
Right.
And then they get to seek validation for their suffering.
Man, that's pretty intense. Are there other people involved in this game too, like besides the person who's drinking?
Oh, yeah, for sure. This game often involves a whole cast of characters. You got the alcoholic, of course,
Yeah.
but then you have the enabler. That's the person who might try to, protect the drinker, from the consequences of their actions. And then there's the persecutor. They're always criticizing, judging. And then you can't forget the rescuer, the one who's always trying to fix the situation.
It sounds like a whole play almost. Like everyone's got their assigned role.
Exactly. It's a whole dynamic. Okay,
Yeah.
what about someone who they always seem to be setting themselves up for failure or criticism? Is that a game too?
Oh yeah, I know people like that. It's like they're constantly making mistakes or provoking people or just acting in ways that like invite criticism and rejection.
Yeah, that could be the game Berne calls Kick Me. And it can be heartbreaking, really, because the people playing this game, they often seem to be sabotaging themselves.
Yeah, it's like they're almost asking to be mistreated. I don't get it. What could the payoff possibly be in that situation? Doesn't seem very rewarding.
Well, Berne suggests that the payoff is actually confirming a belief, a really deep-seated belief, often coming from childhood,
Yeah.
that they're unworthy, or that they deserve to be punished. So they're unconsciously seeking to validate that negative self-image.
Wow. So of like they're
Wow.
trapped in this cycle of self-sabotage, trying to prove their own negative beliefs right.
Exactly. It's a way of maintaining this familiar, painful, psychological equilibrium, I guess you could say.
This is fascinating, but it's also pretty heavy stuff. It makes you wonder, are there any good games? Or are they all ultimately harmful?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Now, Berne, he didn't believe that all games were bad, inherently bad. He recognized that some games, they could actually have positive social contributions. Take Busman's Holiday, for example.
Busman's Holiday. What's that? Sounds like a vacation gone wrong.
Well, it's actually when they use their leisure time to engage in activities related to their work. So they might take a vacation to a conference, for example. Or they spend their free time reading industry journals.
So they're still working even when they're supposed to be relaxing.
Yeah. But it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? They might actually enjoy their work. They might find it fulfilling. And plus, it could lead to, professional growth, new opportunities.
Okay, so it's not always about exploitation or negative payoffs. Are there any other good games?
Yeah. There's Happy to Help. This is when someone, they genuinely enjoy helping other people, even if there might be some underlying motivations, like maybe they get satisfaction from feeling needed or competent, but their actions are still benefiting other people.
Yeah, and the world definitely needs more people who are willing to, to lend a hand.
For sure. It seems like the takeaway here is that even seemingly positive behavior can have complex motivations.
Totally. And the important thing is to be aware of those motivations, but without judging ourselves or other people too harshly.
Yeah, I think that's key. We've explored some specific examples now, of
Yeah.
these games people play and how they can manifest in our relationships, our daily interactions.
This is a lot to take in, but it's incredibly insightful. It makes you wonder, though, what's the point of all this analysis? Where does it lead? What's the ultimate goal of understanding these games?
Well, for Berne, the ultimate goal was to move beyond games, to achieve a state of greater autonomy. He defined autonomy as the recovery of awareness, spontaneity,
Yeah.
and intimacy.
Okay, so we've been on this journey through the land of games, but now I'm really curious about this whole idea of autonomy.
Yeah.
Berne, he called it the ultimate goal, right? It's like a place where we can move beyond these patterns, these often unconscious patterns of interaction.
Right, getting out of those ruts.
It sounds pretty liberating. So how do we actually get there? What's the path to reclaiming this awareness, the spontaneity, and the intimacy?
Well, Bernardi, he believed that our early experiences play a huge role, especially with our parents.
Oh yeah, our childhood.
From the moment we're born,
Mm-hmm.
we're being taught how to behave, think, even feel. It really shapes how we interact with the world.
So we're essentially programmed from childhood. Does that mean we're stuck with these patterns?
Well, it's not quite that deterministic. It's not all set in stone.
Okay, good.
While these early influences, they run deep, Berne argued we still have choice.
Okay, so there's hope.
We make decisions early on about how to adapt to our parents' expectations. And those decisions, even if they're unconscious, they shape our behavior.
So it's not all predetermined. Okay, that's good to know.
Hmm.
But if these early decisions limit our awareness, spontaneity, and intimacy, how do we reclaim those capacities? Like, where do we even begin?
Okay, well, let's start with awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Berne, he described it as the ability to see and experience the world, but in our own unique way, free from those ingrained patterns. Remember that example we talked about, the little boy who lost his pure joy in bird watching when his dad started labeling all the birds?
Yeah, I remember that. It was like his direct experience. It got like filtered through his dad's lens,
Yeah,
He lost that sense of just wonder, pure curiosity.
Reclaiming awareness. It's about rediscovering that direct, unfiltered experience. It's about noticing our own thoughts, feelings, and perceptions, but without judgment
Yeah.
or interpretation.
So it's like cultivating mindfulness, like
Yeah.
being present in the moment, really paying attention to what's happening both internally and externally.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. What about spontaneity? How do we get that back?
I need some of that.
Well, think of spontaneity as like accessing that free, playful energy of the child ego state.
Oh, right, the child.
It's about allowing ourselves to express our emotions, desires, impulses, but in a healthy way.
Yeah, that can be tough though, because we're often like conditioned to suppress our true selves, to be appropriate or polite all the time. It's like we're constantly editing ourselves.
Yeah, and it's understandable. Yet we often fear judgment, rejection if we let our guard down.
Right, of course.
But true spontaneity, it comes from a place of self-acceptance, authenticity.
So it's about embracing our inner child, that playful, curious part of ourselves, but in a way that's aligned with who we are as adults.
You got it. It's about integrating the adult ego state, so we can express that spontaneity, but in a way that's both authentic and responsible. We're not aiming to become reckless, but rather to tap into that wellspring of creativity and joy that often gets stifled as we grow up.
Yeah, it's like that joy gets buried under all those layers of shoulds and should nots. I'm starting to see how these three capacities, the awareness, the spontaneity, and intimacy, how they're all intertwined, like they build on each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can't really have one without the others.
Yeah, and that brings us to intimacy.
Intimacy.
Berne believed that genuine intimacy, it requires all three.
It does.
We need awareness to be present, and spontaneity to be open and expressive, and then a willingness to be vulnerable.
That's the key.
To let someone truly see us. That sounds both terrifying and exhilarating at the same time.
It can be both, for sure. Intimacy is about connecting with another person on a deep, authentic level. No games. No masks.
So it's about letting go of those manipulative behaviors and allowing ourselves to be like truly seen and known, just raw and real.
Yeah. And it's not always easy. It takes a willingness to take risks, to step outside our comfort zones, but the rewards they're immeasurable.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Berne believed that intimacy, it's the most rewarding way to structure our time, right?
Yeah.
That it leads to a sense of connection and fulfillment and joy. And that goes beyond like anything we can achieve through games.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that we all long for, even if we don't always know how to get there.
Right.
This deep dive into games people play, it's been really eye-opening.
Okay.
It's like you've given me a whole new way of looking at my own interactions, and my own motivations.
Well, that's fantastic to hear.
Thank
And
you.
remember, the journey toward autonomy, it's ongoing. It's not like we just arrive one day and we're done.
Right.
It's about continually questioning our patterns and making conscious choices and striving for greater awareness, greater spontaneity, greater intimacy in our lives. It's a worthy pursuit, even if it's a lifelong endeavor.
Well said. And thank you for having me. This has been great.
And thank you for joining us on this deep dive into games people play. We hope you've gained some valuable insights into the fascinating world of human interaction. As you go about your day, ask yourself, what games am I playing? And what would it look like to step into a more authentic, more game-free way of being? Until next time, keep diving deep.